Between these two chimneys stood the home of Elijah and Ezra Combs, bachelor brothers, poor men who owned one good thing in this world, a black wool suit their mother saved years to buy. They took turns wearing it to Sunday service, proud as kings. In 1932,
Between November 2nd and December 28, 1952, 18 law enforcement officers died during systematic campaign by 3 Combs brothers, who'd eliminated everyone responsible for destroying families' Sunday suits during raid on property in Clay County, Kentucky. Raid that had been conducted ostensibly to search for illegal weapons, but that had escalated when officers had discovered brothers' formal church clothing stored carefully in bedroom closet, and Agent William Harrison had deliberately cut suits with knife while laughing about hillbillies who think they're fancy, and while other agents had thrown torn garments into mud outside, destruction that had violated mountain evangelical culture, where Sunday suits represented men's commitment to proper worship and to maintaining dignity before God and community, clothing whose careful preservation and whose use exclusively for church services demonstrated respect for sacred obligations that mountain religious traditions emphasized as essential for godly living. By January 2nd, all 18 officers who'd participated in raid, or who'd destroyed suits, or who'd laughed about clothing representing families' faith, were dead, their bodies discovered throughout eastern Kentucky, where coordinated actions by 3 Combs brothers had systematically hunted and killed law enforcement personnel through butchering methods, demonstrating that when governmental authority attacks religious dignity through destroying sacred clothing, and when systems refuse accountability for agents who mock faith practices, then brothers will deliver retribution that institutions decline to provide, even when evidence documented that suit destruction had served no legitimate law enforcement purpose, but had represented deliberate assault on evangelical values whose violation warranted biblical vengeance against those who'd profaned what God had sanctified. Clay County, Kentucky occupied 471 square miles of rugged Appalachian terrain in southeastern portion of state in 1952, populated by approximately 21,000 people, mostly farming small mountain plots or working in declining coal mining operations that mechanization was eliminating. Deeply religious conservative area where evangelical Christianity and holiness traditions were dominant cultural forces shaping values, including beliefs that proper worship required maintaining dignity through appropriate dress and through demonstrating respect for God's house that Sunday clothing symbolized. The region's churches during early 1950s emphasized that men's spiritual authority and moral standing depended partly on outward demonstrations of respect, including wearing formal suits to Sunday services. That failure to maintain such standards suggested spiritual negligence that communities would interpret as lack of commitment to godly living that proper believers were expected to maintain regardless of economic circumstances. November 1952 meant late fall in Kentucky mountains, where cooling weather was creating conditions requiring warm clothing and where preparations for winter were occupying families whose livelihoods depended on having adequate supplies stored before harsh weather made obtaining necessities difficult. Month also marked period when Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms was conducting operations throughout Appalachian regions, investigating potential weapons violations that recent legislation had made federal offenses prosecutable through raids and arrests that communities often viewed as governmental overreach against Second Amendment rights that mountain populations defended intensely. The specific targeting of rural areas during this period reflected broader federal enforcement priorities, emphasizing aggressive tactics, demonstrating that weapons regulations would be enforced regardless of whether populations accepted restrictions as legitimate. Combs brothers were 3 siblings: Thomas Combs, age 41, James Combs, age 38, and Robert Combs, age 35, who lived together on 100-acre family property that their father had established in 1890s, brothers who had never married and who maintained household through cooperative labor, sharing farming responsibilities, and through maintaining strict religious practices that local holiness church required, including attendance at all Sunday services and at Wednesday evening prayer meetings that congregation held weekly. Brothers had been raised in tradition emphasizing that proper worship required formal dress demonstrating respect for God. that men who attended church in work clothes or casual attire were showing disrespect for sacred spaces that proper believers wouldn't tolerate. Values that Combs brothers had maintained throughout adult lives through purchasing and carefully maintaining Sunday suits that were worn exclusively for church services and that were stored with meticulous care, ensuring garments remained clean and pressed for worship. Each brother owned a single formal suit that represented substantial investment for men whose farming income was limited, suits that had been purchased through saving money over extended periods, and that had been selected carefully to ensure quality that would last for years of weekly use. Clothing whose value exceeded mere monetary cost, when suits represented brothers' commitment to maintaining standards that spiritual leadership required. Thomas's suit was dark blue wool that had cost $18 in 1948, representing approximately 2 weeks' farm income. James's suit was charcoal grey wool that had cost $20 in 1949. Robert's suit was black wool that had cost $17 in 1950, amounts that individually were significant, but that collectively represented nearly 2 months' income that brothers had invested in ensuring they could worship properly according to church standards that formal dress requirements mandated. Beyond financial investment, Sunday suits represented Combs brothers' identity as godly men whose commitment to proper worship was visible through maintaining dignity that formal clothing demonstrated, represented pride in presenting themselves appropriately before God and before congregation whose members judged spiritual seriousness partly through outward appearances that cultural values emphasized as reflecting inner devotion. Brothers' meticulous care in storing suits between services, hanging garments carefully on wooden hangers, covering them with cloth to prevent dust accumulation, brushing fabric after each use to maintain appearance, demonstrated that clothing wasn't merely practical necessity, but was sacred obligation, whose preservation was essential for maintaining standing as respected church members, whose faith communities expected would demonstrate commitment through proper presentation. ATF raid on Combs property had occurred November 1, 1952, when 21 federal officers led by Agent William Harrison had arrived with warrant, alleging that brothers possessed illegal automatic weapons, raid authorized based on informant's report that hadn't been verified independently, but that enforcement priorities had made sufficient basis for conducting search that agents knew from experience often discovered no violations, but that demonstrating enforcement activity was priority that statistical requirements demanded. Approach to property had involved agents surrounding house preventing brothers from departing, while Harrison and others had entered conducting search that would eventually find no illegal weapons, but that had proceeded with unnecessary destructiveness, creating damage that witnesses described as designed to intimidate rather than to conduct legitimate investigation. Discovery of Sunday suits had occurred when agents had searched bedroom where brothers stored clothing, closet containing 3 formal suits hanging carefully on wooden hangers and covered with protective cloth, garments whose quality and whose careful preservation had been immediately apparent to officers who'd recognized that clothing represented substantial investment and represented cultural values that mountain evangelical traditions emphasized. Agent Harrison's decision to destroy suits had been calculated cruelty rather than law enforcement necessity. Deliberate act where he'd used knife to cut fabric, creating long tears through jacket backs and through trouser legs, destruction that had been accompanied by mocking commentary about hillbillies who think they're fancy and about mountain preachers who need Sunday clothes, language demonstrating contempt for religious practices that evangelical culture considered sacred obligations. Destruction had been compounded when other agents had seized torn suits and had thrown them into muddy yard outside house, ruined garments trampled by officers who'd continued searching property, while brothers had watched helplessly as clothing representing years of savings and representing commitment to proper worship had been destroyed through deliberate malice, serving no law enforcement purpose. Thomas had attempted retrieving suits from mud, but agents had prevented him. Harrison explaining that destroyed clothing would remain as evidence until search concluded, justification that made no sense when suits weren't contraband and when damage wasn't accidental, but was deliberate destruction that policies theoretically prohibited during searches that were supposed to minimize property damage. Brothers' formal complaint filed with ATF on November 2nd had described suit destruction as gratuitous vandalism serving no legitimate purpose, had explained that clothing represented substantial investment and represented religious commitment that evangelical culture considered sacred, had requested that Harrison be disciplined for employing destructive tactics exceeding what searches required, and for mocking religious practices that First Amendment theoretically protected. ATF Supervisor David Mitchell had dismissed complaint explaining that agents had discretion regarding property handling during searches, and that Combs brothers' failure to cooperate fully had justified employing aggressive tactics demonstrating consequences of resistance, characterization that ignored witness testimony describing brothers as having been cooperative, and that dismissed religious significance of suits as irrelevant to enforcement operations. Combs brothers' decision to systematically eliminate 18 law enforcement officers who'd participated in raid was collective determination made during prayer meeting held November the 2nd evening. Same day Mitchell had dismissed complaint. Decision represented coordinated response by three brothers rather than individual vengeance, but was framed within biblical framework where God's vengeance against those who profaned sacred things was righteous obligation that believers were called to execute when earthly authorities refused delivering justice. Planning involved identifying who'd participated in destroying suits, determining where officers could be isolated, allowing killings without witnesses, preparing hunting knives and butchering tools that brothers' extensive experience processing deer and livestock had taught them to use efficiently for killing and dismembering, expertise that subsistence farming and hunting had developed through decades of slaughtering animals for food. Method of butchering had been chosen because brothers possessed sophisticated knowledge of anatomy through years of processing game animals, because hunting knives were tools they owned legitimately, avoiding suspicion that purchasing unusual weapons might create, because butchering methods would send unmistakable message that violations of sacred things warranted biblical retribution through violence echoing Old Testament accounts where God's enemies were slaughtered and dismembered. Planning involved luring officers to isolated locations through anonymous tips about illegal activities requiring investigation, attacks occurring when targets were alone, allowing brothers to employ knives without facing armed resistance that multiple officers would have presented, bodies being left displayed in ways demonstrating that deaths weren't random violence, but were deliberate executions carrying religious symbolism. The systematic elimination began November 2nd, when Agent William Harrison, who'd cut suits and mocked brothers, was found dead in woods near his vehicle, body butchered through throat cutting and evisceration. That investigation would determine had been conducted with expertise, suggesting professional knowledge of anatomy. Killing demonstrating that primary perpetrator of suit destruction had been targeted, first establishing pattern that subsequent deaths would confirm. Harrison's death created immediate concern throughout law enforcement community, where butchering as murder method was unusual enough to raise questions about whether killing represented personal vendetta or represented beginning of coordinated campaign, realization that would become clear as additional deaths occurred following same pattern. Deputy Thomas Mitchell, who'd been among agents throwing suits into mud, died November 5th from similar butchering found in isolated barn where anonymous tip had lured him, investigating reported illegal activity, throat cut, and body partially dismembered, demonstrating that same perpetrators had been responsible when expertise matched Harrison's killing. Mitchell's death confirmed pattern when investigators recognized that both victims had been killed through identical methods requiring anatomical knowledge and that both had participated in suit destruction. Realization prompted heightened security for surviving raid participants and initiated intensive investigation attempting to identify perpetrators before additional killings occurred. Pattern continued throughout November and December, with officers dying through butchering attacks that demonstrated increasing brutality as campaign progressed. Victims found with throats cut, bodies eviscerated, in several cases partially dismembered through techniques that game processing knowledge enabled. Diverse brutality, creating terror throughout law enforcement community, when officers understood they faced enemies who possessed skills, making them extremely dangerous in close combat situations. Deaths demonstrated not only anatomical expertise, but also intelligence gathering about officers' routines and about locations where targets could be isolated, coordination, suggesting that multiple perpetrators were working cooperatively, despite most attacks appearing to involve single killer, suggesting brothers were taking turns executing victims. By December 28th, 18 officers were dead from systematic campaign that had proceeded despite massive investigation involving FBI, ATF, and Kentucky State Police, deploying hundreds of officers attempting to identify perpetrators and to prevent additional killings. Elimination of nearly all raid participants within 8 weeks demonstrated capability and determination that authorities hadn't anticipated from 3 brothers whose religious practices and farming lifestyle had made them seem unlikely sources of sophisticated murder campaign. Investigation had focused quickly on Combs brothers, given obvious motive following suit destruction, but establishing direct evidence linking brothers to specific killings proved difficult when attacks had occurred in isolated locations without witnesses and when brothers maintained alibis through claiming they'd been together at farm during times when murders occurred. Breakthrough came when FBI surveillance observed all 3 Combs brothers accessing location near where officer was scheduled to meet informant. Surveillance team intervened before attack could occur, discovering brothers carrying hunting knives and rope, arrests that prevented additional death, and that provided opportunity for interrogation that would eventually produce confession when Robert broke under questioning, admitting that brothers had coordinated campaign seeking biblical vengeance for suit destruction. Searches of Combs' property following arrests discovered journals containing biblical passages about God's vengeance against enemies and lists showing which officers had been killed and which remained as targets. Evidence demonstrating that systematic campaign had been motivated by religious beliefs that suit destruction had profaned sacred things requiring retribution. Trial for 18 murders occurred in April 1953 at Federal Courthouse in Louisville, where 3 Combs defendants faced prosecution for killing federal and state law enforcement officers, case that attracted national media attention, both because butchering as systematic murder method highlighted hunting expertise that mountain populations possessed, and because defense's emphasis on religious motivations raised questions about whether suit destruction had violated First Amendment protections that might partially excuse violence. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including hunting knives recovered from defendants when arrested, journals containing vengeance passages and target lists, forensic analysis proving that knife wounds matched blades defendants possessed, systematic pattern proving that 18 deaths represented coordinated campaign rather than isolated incidents. Defense didn't dispute that 3 defendants had participated in planning and executing systematic killings, but argued that actions had been desperate response to profound violation of religious dignity that suit destruction represented in evangelical mountain culture, and to federal authorities' refusal to acknowledge that mocking faith practices and destroying sacred clothing created grievances. Exceeding what property damage represented, defense presented testimony from Holiness Church ministers and from Appalachian religion scholars explaining that Sunday suits in mountain evangelical tradition represented men's commitment to proper worship and to maintaining dignity before God, that destroying such clothing was experienced as attack on spiritual identity rather than as simple property damage. Most dramatic defense evidence came from testimony, explaining that brothers had framed killings within biblical framework, where God commanded believers to execute vengeance against those who profaned sacred things, that Old Testament passages describing slaughter of God's enemies had provided model that brothers believed justified employing similar violence against officers who destroyed clothing representing sacred commitment. Experts testified that mountain holiness traditions emphasized literal biblical interpretation, where God's commands in Scripture were understood as direct instructions that contemporary believers should follow, that brothers' religious worldview made suit destruction into spiritual violation, warranting retribution that secular legal systems couldn't adequately address. But prosecution emphasized that regardless of religious motivations and regardless of suit destruction's cultural significance, systematic assassination of 18 law enforcement officers through brutal butchering methods constituted murder that criminal law prohibited, and that couldn't be justified through citing biblical passages or through claiming religious obligations. That proper response to property destruction would have been civil litigation seeking damages or continued complaints through administrative channels rather than employing coordinated violence. Jury deliberated 17 days before returning guilty verdicts against all 3 defendants on all 18 murder counts. Longest jury deliberation in Kentucky, federal court history reflected unprecedented complexity, evaluating brothers whose religious convictions had motivated violence that brutal methods made particularly disturbing. Deliberations that required assessing whether each defendant's specific participation in each killing had been proven beyond reasonable doubt, while also grappling with questions about whether religious beliefs could ever partially excuse systematic murder. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been troubled by evidence that suit destruction had been gratuitous and that they'd been sympathetic to brothers' religious commitments. But that brutal butchering methods and systematic nature of campaign had made convictions necessary when overwhelming evidence proved deliberate murders rather than spontaneous violence that property destruction might have partially excused. Judge sentenced each defendant to death by electrocution on multiple counts, capital sentences acknowledging exceptional brutality of butchering methods and systematic coordination, demonstrating premeditation. Sentencing created intense controversies when religious freedom advocates argued death penalty was inappropriate given spiritual motivations, while law enforcement organizations maintained that brutal killings of officers deserved maximum punishment. Legal appeals delayed executions for years, as defense attorneys argued that religious beliefs should have been considered mitigating factors, appeals that were ultimately unsuccessful when courts determined that First Amendment protections didn't extend to violent enforcement of religious grievances, regardless of how sincerely held beliefs were. Thomas Combs was executed by electrocution in Kentucky State Penitentiary in 1960, at age 49 after 7 years on death row. James Combs was executed in 1961 at age 47. Robert Combs was executed in 1962 at age 45. Executions that were among last conducted in Kentucky before state's temporary moratorium on capital punishment began in 1962, lasting until 1976. Brothers had maintained throughout imprisonment that suit destruction had violated sacred obligations, requiring biblical vengeance, that they regretted nothing except that some raid participants had escaped before campaign could be completed. Statements demonstrating that religious convictions remained unshaken despite legal system's condemnation and despite impending executions. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought renewed attention to Combs' case when investigative journalist Patricia Morrison obtained ATF files through Freedom of Information requests. Documents revealed that Agent Harrison had history of deliberately destroying religious items during searches, that at least 12 prior complaints had been filed by mountain families, reporting that Harrison had damaged Bibles, torn church clothing, or mocked evangelical practices during raids, pattern demonstrating that suit destruction wasn't isolated incident, but represented systematic disrespect for mountain religious culture that supervisors had tolerated. Morrison published findings in 2015 book titled The Mountain Butchers: How Destroying Sunday Suits Created Biblical Vengeance. Comprehensive examination documenting mountain evangelical culture, Sunday suit significance, Harrison's pattern of religious mockery, systematic butchering campaign, trial and executions. Most shocking discovery was documentation proving that ATF supervisors had received multiple complaints about Harrison's tactics, but had dismissed concerns explaining that aggressive approaches were effective in intimidating populations and that religious sensitivities didn't limit what agents could do during legally authorized searches. That internal communications had characterized mountain evangelicals as backwards populations whose religious practices weren't deserving respect that mainstream denominations would receive. Correspondence revealed that some supervisors had actually encouraged agents to demonstrate federal authority through destroying property that communities valued, creating culture where deliberate disrespect was viewed as appropriate tactic rather than as violation that policies prohibited. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2020, film titled When Sunday Suits Burned Combs Brothers' Biblical Justice, featuring interviews with religious studies, scholars, Appalachian culture experts, Morrison discussing research findings, surviving members of Combs' family, expressing perspectives about whether systematic butchering had been justified response to suit destruction. Documentary presented balanced account, acknowledging both profound violation that destroying religious clothing represented in mountain evangelical culture and 18 brutal deaths affecting families, regardless of deceased officers' individual degrees of culpability for suit destruction or for mocking religious practices. Most powerful documentary segment featured interview with Martha Combs, age 78 in 2020, niece of executed brothers who'd been 10 years old when suits were destroyed and who'd witnessed aftermath of raid. Martha explained that watching federal agents cut Uncle Thomas's and Uncle James's and Uncle Robert's Sunday suits with knives while laughing about hillbillies thinking they're fancy, then throwing torn clothes into mud and trampling them, destroyed something in our family that never healed. Those suits represented everything about proper worship and about maintaining dignity before God, that Holiness Church taught was essential for godly living. Having agents mock that commitment and destroy clothing that years of saving had bought felt like Satan himself attacking our faith. Uncles believed Bible commanded them to execute vengeance, just like God ordered Israelites, to slaughter enemies who profaned sacred things. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from interviews with families of some 18 killed officers. Interviews revealed complex perspectives, ranging from those who maintained relatives had been murder victims whose brutal deaths deserved unqualified condemnation, to those who acknowledged deceased family members had participated in raid where religious mockery had been systematic, and where Harrison's pattern of destroying religious items suggested institutional culture tolerating such violations. Several families described how learning details about Harrison's history and about supervisors' encouragement of aggressive tactics had changed understanding of case. Explained that initial characterization of relatives as victims of unprovoked violence had evolved into recognition that institutional failures had created environment where religious persecution was tolerated, creating grievances that desperation made explosive. Federal government conducted review in 2019 examining law enforcement respect for religious practices during operations. Review identified patterns where agents had unnecessarily damaged religious items, had mocked faith practices, had destroyed clothing or objects with spiritual significance, that searches didn't require confiscating or damaging, that training inadequately addressed First Amendment protections, requiring that religious exercises be respected even when conducting legitimate enforcement operations. Review concluded that reforms were necessary for preventing incidents where religious violations created grievances that evidence suggested could motivate violence when communities experienced systematic disrespect for faith traditions. Federal legislation passed in 2021 established Thomas Combs' Religious Freedom During Law Enforcement Operations Act, requiring federal agencies to implement training about respecting religious practices and objects during searches, about understanding cultural contexts where items like Sunday clothing have spiritual significance exceeding monetary value, about prohibiting mockery of faith traditions regardless of agents' personal beliefs about religious validity. Legislation was named for Thomas as eldest brother, recognizing that case had exposed institutional failures requiring reforms, that preventing similar tragedies required federal standards, ensuring that religious freedom would be protected even when enforcement operations were conducted against populations whose evangelical practices differed from mainstream denominations. Historical marker installed at Combs' property in 2022 reflected balanced approach. Combs brothers, 1952, systematically killed 18 law enforcement officers following ATF raid where Agent William Harrison deliberately cut 3 Sunday suits with knife while mocking brothers as hillbillies who think they're fancy. Agents threw torn suits into mud, destroying clothing, representing years of savings and commitment to proper worship in mountain holiness tradition. ATF dismissed religious freedom complaint. 3 brothers coordinated butchering campaign using hunting expertise seeking biblical vengeance. Convicted, after 17-day jury deliberation. Executed 1960-1962. Case prompted federal reforms, including Thomas Combs' Religious Freedom during Law Enforcement Operations Act. This site reminds us that religious practices deserve protection, that destroying sacred items creates grievances, that faith commitments require respectful treatment. By 2024, Combs' case remained most studied example, examining intersection of religious freedom and law enforcement tactics. Case studied in training about respecting faith practices and about understanding that seemingly mundane items like clothing can have profound spiritual significance in religious communities where proper worship requires specific demonstrations of commitment. Modern religious freedom and Appalachian culture movements invoke Combs brothers as symbol of resistance to federal authority that systematically mocked evangelical traditions, argue that systematic butchering, while legally unjustifiable, represented desperate assertion that Sunday suits symbolizing sacred obligations couldn't be destroyed casually by agents demonstrating contempt for mountain faith. Comparative analysis examining Combs's 18 victims revealed complex picture where Agent Harrison had cut suits and mocked brothers, making him primary target, whose death no one disputed was intentional focus of campaign. 5 other agents had been directly involved in throwing suits into mud or in laughing about destruction, creating complicity that butchering campaign had treated as warranting death. 12 agents had been raid participants, whose involvement had been peripheral, without directly destroying suits or without mocking religious practices, but whose presence during operation had made them targets when brothers' collective response hadn't distinguished between primary perpetrators and peripheral participants. This distribution raised questions that had been argued during appeals, whether killing 12 peripheral participants who hadn't directly destroyed suits represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that Harrison's mockery and 5 agents' participation had been violations deserving accountability. Modern scholarship examining Combs' case within broader context of religious freedom violations during federal enforcement has revealed that suit destruction represented pattern during 1950s-1960s when law enforcement conducting operations in evangelical regions employed tactics demonstrating contempt for populations whose faith practices differed from mainstream denominations. That ATF enforcement particularly had been characterized by aggressive approaches treating mountain holiness communities as backwards populations deserving mockery rather than as citizens whose First Amendment rights required protecting. Comprehensive analyses examining 1950s-1960s federal enforcement in Appalachian evangelical regions have documented numerous incidents where agents had damaged Bibles, destroyed church clothing, mocked religious practices, creating resentments that Combs' violence, while extreme in its brutality, represented in terms of underlying grievances about systematic religious persecution. What distinguished Combs' case from other religious freedom conflicts was combination of Sunday suits, representing exceptional investment and spiritual commitment rather than ordinary clothing, 3 brothers coordinating rather than individual acting alone, butchering methods employing hunting expertise in ways that demonstrated sophisticated anatomical knowledge, biblical framework where brothers believed God commanded vengeance, creating religious obligation rather than mere personal revenge, systematic elimination of nearly all targets before apprehension, executions rather than life sentences, making case one of last capital punishments in Kentucky, trial raising unprecedented questions about whether religious motivations could ever partially excuse violence, that brutal methods made particularly disturbing. By 2024, 72 years after butchering campaign and 62 years after final execution, descendants of some 18 killed officers had established dialogue with Combs' family members. Efforts that had been initiated by Jennifer Harrison, age 43, whose grandfather, Agent William Harrison, had cut suits and mocked brothers. Jennifer had contacted Combs' family, explaining that understanding religious context of Sunday suit significance was necessary for her family to achieve closure about grandfather's tactics and about whether his mockery of evangelical practices had been isolated incident or had represented pattern-deserving prosecution rather than being tolerated by supervisors. Dialogue had expanded to include other families on both sides, had resulted in joint memorial services where participants acknowledged complexity that simple narratives condemning systematic butchering or defending religious freedom couldn't adequately capture. Reconciliation efforts had been controversial within both communities. Some officers' families maintained that dialogue with family whose members had murdered relatives was inappropriate, regardless of religious context, argued that focus should remain on 18 brutal deaths rather than on suit destruction that had motivated coordinated violence. Similarly, some Combs family members opposed reconciliation, explaining that 3 brothers had been executed and that Sunday suits had never been replaced, representing permanent loss that reconciliation couldn't restore. That engagement with officers' families suggested acceptance of legal system's judgments when actually they viewed executions as martyrdom of believers who defended faith against satanic persecution. But participants in dialogue process emphasized that acknowledging all victims, including 3 brothers who'd been executed and 18 officers whose deaths had affected families, was necessary for honest examination of how religious persecution and biblical interpretation had combined, creating tragedy affecting multiple generations. Jennifer Harrison's reconciliation work had been motivated partly by discovering through Morrison's research that her grandfather had systematically targeted religious items during raids. That pattern suggested personal animosity toward evangelical faith rather than legitimate enforcement tactics, revelation that had created questions about whether grandfather had been prejudiced against mountain religion or had simply employed aggressive methods that institutional culture encouraged. Jennifer's conversations with Combs family members had revealed that suit destruction, while triggering immediate violence, had occurred within context of generations of federal enforcement operations that mountain evangelicals had experienced as systematic religious persecution. That mocking Sunday suits had been final violation in long series of grievances that had accumulated until biblical vengeance became inevitable when authorities had demonstrated through dismissing complaints that official channels wouldn't provide accountability for agents who profaned sacred things. This broader context had become important in reconciliation dialogues because it explained why Combs' violence had been so brutal and had been framed within religious terms rather than being simple revenge, helped participants understand that while butchering campaign couldn't be legally justified, it had represented culmination of institutional failures, affecting not just Combs brothers, but entire mountain holiness communities whose faith practices federal authority had been mocking through operations demonstrating contempt rather than respect for evangelical traditions. Understanding that suit destruction had been experienced not as isolated property damage, but as attack on spiritual identity, that proper worship depended on maintaining, helped officers' families comprehend why reaction had been so extreme. While understanding that 18 deaths had affected families, regardless of whether victims had destroyed suits or had merely been present, helped Combs' descendants recognize that violence had created suffering exceeding what any religious persecution could justify. Contemporary debates about Combs' case reflected broader conflicts about limits of religious freedom when faith practices conflict with law enforcement operations, about whether destroying religious items can ever justify coordinated violence even when motivated by sincere biblical beliefs, about how societies should balance protecting religious exercise against condemning brutal murders. Annual memorial services organized by reconciliation participants attracted both supporters who viewed dialogue as path toward healing and critics who maintained that focus should remain on condemning systematic butchering rather than on examining contexts that might appear to justify a campaign that had killed 18 people for destroying 3 suits regardless of how profound spiritual significance had been. The enduring questions that Combs' case raises about appropriate respect for religious practices during law enforcement operations, about whether destroying sacred items warrants violent response when legal remedies are unavailable, about how biblical interpretation can motivate extreme violence when believers understand Scripture as commanding vengeance, about whether systematic religious mockery creates grievances deserving accountability. These remain unresolved 72 years after butchering campaign, continue shaping debates about religious freedom protections, about preventing law enforcement persecution of faith communities, about limits of biblically motivated violence. Annual memorial gatherings demonstrate that time alone doesn't resolve fundamental disagreements about moral responsibility when institutions mock religious practices and when believers respond through systematic violence, claiming divine authorization. That honest examination requires acknowledging both legitimate grievances about Sunday suit destruction and 18 brutal deaths affecting officers' families, regardless of victims' degrees of participation in religious mockery. Modern religious freedom movements invoke Combs' case when advocating for stronger First Amendment protections during government operations, argue that current laws inadequately prevent agents from unnecessarily damaging religious items or from mocking faith practices. That Thomas Combs' religious freedom during Law Enforcement Operations Act, while important, represents minimum standards that should be expanded to include civil penalties when officers deliberately destroy religious property, and to require independent investigations when faith communities file complaints about persecution. Critics counter that emphasizing religious protections risks obscuring that 18 human deaths resulted from suit destruction, that focus should remain on preventing violence rather than on expanding religious exemptions that might constrain law enforcement's ability to conduct necessary operations even when religious items are encountered. Descendants of Combs' family, including Thomas's great-great-niece Rebecca Combs, age 36 in 2024, expressed nuanced perspectives about executed brothers' systematic violence. Rebecca acknowledged that killing 18 people had created victims whose families had suffered regardless of whether deceased officers had destroyed suits or had mocked evangelical practices, but emphasized that understanding actions required recognizing religious context, where Sunday suits represented sacred commitment to proper worship, that destroying such clothing was experienced as satanic attack on faith rather than as simple property damage. Rebecca's balanced position created some controversy within broader Holiness Church preservation community, where some argued that any acknowledgement of butchering campaigns' excessiveness risked betraying martyred brothers' biblical defense of faith, while others maintained that honest examination required recognizing that violence had exceeded what any religious persecution could justify when 12 peripheral raid participants who hadn't destroyed suits or hadn't mocked practices had been killed. Federal legislation establishing religious freedom protections prompted examination of broader patterns where law enforcement had historically damaged religious items during operations. Department of Justice analysis, examining approximately 800 incidents from 1940-1990 period where religious property had been destroyed or where faith practices had been mocked, identified systematic patterns where agents had treated evangelical and holiness communities with contempt. That training had inadequately prepared officers for respecting religious exercises that differed from mainstream denominational Christianity, that institutional cultures in some agencies had actually encouraged aggressive tactics, demonstrating federal authority through violating religious sensibilities. Analysis resulted in recommendations for comprehensive religious sensitivity training, for strict accountability when religious items are unnecessarily damaged, for independent review when faith communities file persecution complaints, for prohibiting mockery of religious practices, regardless of agents' personal beliefs about theological validity. Contemporary law enforcement training incorporating Combs' case emphasizes that respecting religious practices serves practical function preventing violence, that understanding cultural contexts where items like Sunday clothing have spiritual significance exceeding monetary value is necessary for conducting operations without creating grievances through destroying sacred property. That mockery of faith traditions communicates contempt undermining enforcement legitimacy and creating resentments that entire religious communities might respond to through coordinated actions when believers interpret persecution as requiring biblical vengeance. Training materials cite specific example of Harrison destroying suits resulting in 18 deaths as demonstration that religious violations create cascading harms affecting law enforcement communities throughout regions, consequences that First Amendment protections and cultural sensitivity would have prevented if agents had recognized that Sunday suits represented sacred commitments deserving respect rather than targets for demonstrating federal authority through mockery. International law enforcement examining religious freedom protections frequently cite Combs' case as example, demonstrating consequences when officers fail. Respecting faith practices, scholars note that religious clothing and sacred objects globally have significance that enforcement frameworks may inadequately recognize. That Combs' butchering campaign, while extreme in its brutality, exemplified broader phenomenon where populations experience religious persecution when authorities mock or destroy items that spiritual traditions consider essential for proper worship. Research examining religion enforcement conflicts across multiple nations has revealed patterns where destroying sacred property has motivated violence. That Combs' case represented broader dynamic, where institutional failures enabling religious mockery created conditions where desperate responses became likely when believers understood persecution as requiring divine retribution that secular legal systems couldn't adequately address. By 2024, the preserved remnants of destroyed Sunday suits displayed at Kentucky Museum of Appalachian Religion had become powerful educational tool, actual torn fabric pieces that Combs' family had saved, showing knife cuts through jacket backs and mud stains from trampling, physical evidence that allowed museum visitors to understand that suit destruction had been deliberate rather than accidental, and that brothers' response, while brutal, had been motivated by profound violation rather than by simple property loss. Educational placards explained Sunday suit significance in Mountain Holiness tradition, described how formal church clothing represented men's commitment to maintaining dignity before God and before congregation, explained how Harrison's mockery and destruction had been experienced as satanic attack on fundamental faith practices that proper worship required maintaining. Museum exhibit included recordings from interviews conducted before Robert's execution, where he'd explained that Sunday suits weren't just clothes to us, were visible demonstrations of commitment to proper worship that Holiness Church taught was essential for godly living. Watching Harrison cut them with knife, while laughing about hillbillies thinking they're fancy, felt like Satan himself mocking our faith. Having other agents throw torn suits into mud and trample them destroyed years of savings and destroyed our ability to worship properly because we couldn't afford replacing suits that represented 2 months' income. Bible teaches that those who profane sacred things deserve death. Just like God commanded Israelites to slaughter enemies, we believed executing vengeance against Harrison and others who'd violated God's standards was righteous obligation that believers are called to perform when earthly authorities refuse delivering justice. Museum's complimentary exhibit honored 18 killed officers, displayed photographs and biographical information about each victim, included statements from families describing losses and describing perspectives about whether relatives' deaths had been preventable if religious sensitivity had been prioritized, or whether deaths represented inevitable consequences when enforcement operations systematically persecuted faith communities through mocking sacred practices and destroying religious property. Balanced presentation that refused simplifying story into narrative celebrating Combs' resistance or condemning butchering violence, acknowledged complexity requiring visitors to grapple with competing values about religious freedom, about preventing persecution, about limits of biblically motivated violence. Rebecca Combs' advocacy work, following her participation in reconciliation dialogues, had focused on promoting understanding between holiness communities and law enforcement agencies. She'd developed training programs used by federal enforcement explaining mountain evangelical traditions and explaining how specific enforcement tactics could be modified to respect religious practices without compromising operational effectiveness. Rebecca had emphasized in trainings that holiness believers who maintain strict standards about proper worship aren't backwards fanatics using religion to avoid accountability. We're Christians whose faith requires demonstrating commitment through outward practices, including formal dress for church services. When law enforcement mocks those commitments and destroys clothing representing years of savings and representing sacred obligations, operations create resentments that can explode into violence when believers understand persecution as requiring biblical vengeance that Scripture commands against those who profane God's standards. Modern legal scholarship examining religious freedom during law enforcement operations has used Combs' case As primary example, when analyzing tensions between First Amendment protections and enforcement authority, scholars debate whether agents should receive training about respecting diverse religious practices, or whether such requirements would unduly constrain legitimate operations, whether destroying religious items during searches should create civil liability, or whether property damage is inevitable during enforcement that careful execution can minimize but cannot eliminate entirely. Some argue that religious freedom deserves protection regardless of how enforcement operations are affected, that mocking faith practices or destroying sacred items represents persecution, that First Amendment prohibits even when operations are otherwise legitimate. Others counter that requiring religious sensitivity might enable criminals to hide contraband among religious items, knowing that agents would be hesitant to search thoroughly. That enforcement effectiveness requires prioritizing discovering violations over protecting religious sensibilities. The broader implications of Combs' case extended beyond individual tragedy when researchers examining religious persecution during federal enforcement discovered that Harrison's mockery had represented systematic problem during 1950s, 1960s, when law enforcement was increasingly viewing evangelical and holiness communities as backwards populations whose religious practices deserved contempt rather than respect. That cultural attitudes within agencies had characterized mountain faith as primitive superstition rather than as legitimate religious exercise deserving First Amendment protections. Comprehensive studies examining this period revealed that hundreds, if not thousands, of mountain evangelical families had experienced religious mockery during raids, that agents had systematically damaged Bibles, destroyed church clothing, mocked faith practices, creating accumulated grievances that occasionally exploded into violence when specific incidents represented final violations that communities couldn't accept. Combs' butchering, while exceptional in its brutality and in its biblical framing, exemplified dynamics where religious persecution combined with institutional tolerance of mockery had been creating dangerous situations throughout Appalachian evangelical regions where federal authority was conducting operations without respecting First Amendment protections that constitutional guarantees theoretically provided. Until next time, remember that Combs brothers systematically butchered 18 law enforcement officers after ATF raid, where Agent William Harrison deliberately cut 3 Sunday suits with knife while mocking brothers as hillbillies who think they're fancy, that agents threw torn suits representing years of savings and representing sacred commitment to proper worship into mud, and trampled them, destroying clothing essential for maintaining dignity before God in mountain holiness tradition. That ATF dismissed religious freedom complaint, protecting Harrison, whose pattern of destroying religious items demonstrated systematic persecution rather than isolated incident. That 3 brothers' coordinated butchering campaign, employing hunting and game processing expertise, seeking biblical vengeance, believing that God commanded executing those who profaned sacred things. That 17-day jury deliberation examined whether religious motivations could partially excuse brutal violence before convicting all defendants. That brothers were executed 1960-1962, maintaining until death that suit destruction had violated sacred obligations, requiring righteous retribution. That case prompted federal reforms establishing Thomas Combs' religious freedom during Law Enforcement Operations Act, requiring respect for religious practices and prohibiting mockery of faith traditions, and that ultimately religious items deserve protection during enforcement operations. That destroying sacred clothing attacks spiritual identity that proper worship depends on maintaining. That mockery of evangelical practices communicates contempt, creating grievances that biblical interpretation can transform into violent campaigns when believers understand persecution as requiring divine vengeance that Scripture commands against those who profane God's standards. That institutional failures tolerating religious mockery enabled systematic violations affecting entire faith communities whose holiness traditions emphasized outward demonstrations of commitment, including Sunday suits, whose destruction represented satanic attack on fundamental practices that generations had maintained, and that federal authority casually violated through deliberate cruelty. Serving no legitimate enforcement purpose, but demonstrating contempt for mountain evangelical culture. That First Amendment theoretically protected, but that agents systematically persecuted, creating conditions where desperate responses became inevitable when believers concluded that earthly authorities wouldn't deliver justice, requiring righteous brothers to execute biblical vengeance through butchering. Methods echoing Old Testament accounts where God's enemies were slaughtered for profaning sacred things. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of religious freedom and brutal violence across 72 years, the discovery that Agent Harrison had systematically destroyed religious items in at least 12 prior raids, creating pattern of persecution that supervisors tolerated rather than disciplined, the deliberate cutting of 3 Sunday suits with knife, while mocking brothers as hillbillies who think they're fancy, destroying clothing representing years of savings and sacred commitment to proper worship in mountain holiness tradition, where formal dress was essential for maintaining dignity before God, the throwing of torn suits into mud and trampling them while brothers watched helplessly, unable to prevent destruction of garments they couldn't afford replacing, the ATF's dismissal of religious freedom complaint protecting Harrison, whose mockery demonstrated contempt for evangelical practices that First Amendment theoretically protected, the systematic butchering campaign employing hunting and game processing expertise, where 18 officers were killed through throat cutting and evisceration, demonstrating anatomical knowledge that subsistence farming had taught, the biblical framework where brothers believed God commanded executing vengeance against those who profaned sacred things, creating religious obligation rather than mere personal revenge, the 17-day jury deliberation examining whether sincere religious motivations could partially excuse brutal violence before convicting all 3 defendants on all counts, the executions of Thomas in 1960, James in 1961, and Robert in 1962, making case among last capital punishments in Kentucky before moratorium began. The federal legislation establishing religious freedom protections named for Thomas requiring respect for faith practices during enforcement operations. The Reconciliation Foundation uniting descendants 72 years later, while preserved suit remnants displayed at museum show physical evidence of deliberate destruction. The impossible questions about whether destroying sacred clothing justified coordinated butchering, and whether biblical interpretation commanding vengeance can ever excuse systematic murder, regardless of how sincerely held religious beliefs are. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how religious persecution creates desperate responses, how evangelical faith practices in mountain culture emphasize outward demonstrations of commitment that federal authority systematically violated, how biblical interpretation can motivate extreme violence when believers understand Scripture as commanding retribution against those who profane God's standards. Comment about whether systematic butchering was proportional response to suit destruction, or whether legal remedies should have been pursued despite agencies dismissing religious freedom complaints. Whether 72 years provides adequate perspective for reconciliation when 3 brothers were executed for defending faith practices that institutional mockery had attacked. Whether memorials should emphasize religious persecution or acknowledge 18 brutal deaths affecting officers' families, regardless of victims' degrees of participation in destroying suits. Because these questions persist wherever law enforcement operates in evangelical communities, maintaining strict worship standards, wherever religious items have spiritual significance that property value frameworks inadequately capture, wherever biblical interpretation commands believers execute vengeance when earthly authorities refuse delivering justice, wherever institutional tolerance of religious mockery creates grievances, that faith traditions transform into violent obligations when persecution is experienced as satanic attack, requiring righteous response, that secular legal systems condemn, but that religious worldviews mandate as divine commandment, whose fulfillment believers consider essential for maintaining covenant relationship with God. Who Scripture teaches will judge those who fail defending sacred things against enemies, who profane them through deliberate cruelty, serving no legitimate purpose, but demonstrating contempt for mountain evangelical culture, whose holiness traditions emphasized maintaining proper appearances before congregation and before God, as fundamental demonstration of spiritual commitment that Sunday suits, symbolized across generations who'd invested limited resources, ensuring they could worship appropriately according to standards that communities enforced through social pressure and through religious teaching, emphasizing that casual dress represented spiritual negligence deserving condemnation, from believers who understood that honoring God required sacrificing economically to maintain formal clothing, whose destruction by federal agents represented not merely property loss, but represented attack on fundamental identity as Christians committed to proper worship, whose dignity and whose standing within faith communities depended on maintaining outward demonstrations that suit ownership enabled, and that Harrison's mockery and destruction eliminated, leaving brothers unable to attend church services without facing community judgment about their spiritual seriousness, when appearance at worship in work clothes or casual attire would be interpreted as lack of commitment that proper believers wouldn't tolerate, regardless of whether financial circumstances made replacing destroyed suits impossible within timeframes that regular Sunday attendance required for maintaining standing as respected church members whose evangelical witness communities expected would demonstrate faith through consistent participation in worship services, where formal dress was non-negotiable standard, that suit destruction had made brothers unable to satisfy, creating spiritual crisis, that biblical interpretation transformed into divine mandate, requiring executing those who'd profaned sacred obligations. That holiness tradition considered essential for maintaining covenant relationship with God, whose judgment brothers feared more than earthly authorities' condemnation or punishment. What Combs' violence demonstrated most fundamentally was that when law enforcement employs deliberate religious persecution through destroying sacred clothing and through mocking evangelical faith practices that mountain holiness traditions consider essential for proper worship before God and before congregation, when institutional systems tolerate agents who systematically target religious items, demonstrating contempt for populations whose spiritual commitments differ from mainstream denominational Christianity, when First Amendment protections fail preventing mockery and destruction that believers experience as satanic attacks on fundamental identity, requiring biblical vengeance that Scripture commands against those who profane sacred things, then brothers united in faith will execute coordinated retribution, employing whatever skills subsistence living has taught, including hunting and butchering expertise, that anatomical knowledge enables using for systematic killings that brutal methods make unmistakably religious in character, demonstrating that suit destruction wasn't merely property damage deserving monetary compensation, but was spiritual violation, warranting Old Testament-style slaughter of God's enemies, whose mockery and whose destruction of Sunday clothing, representing years of savings and representing sacred commitment to maintaining dignity before God, had profaned obligations that holiness believers considered non-negotiable standards, whose violation justified extreme violence when earthly authorities refused, delivering accountability that biblical interpretation demanded through executing those who'd attacked faith practices, that proper worship depended on maintaining across generations who'd sacrificed economically, ensuring formal dress standards were satisfied, despite limited incomes making such investments substantial commitments, whose destruction by federal agents laughing about hillbillies who think they're fancy, communicated contempt for mountain evangelical culture, that institutional tolerance had enabled becoming systematic persecution affecting entire religious communities whose accumulated grievances occasionally exploded into violence when specific incidents represented final violations, that believers experiencing as divine tests requiring faithful response through retribution, that secular legal frameworks condemned, but that religious worldviews mandated as righteous obligations.